All right, guys. This is our last content-specific review video. I'm sure you have just finished watching the Period 8 domestic policy review. And so today we're going to head up all of the foreign policy approaches. Really, largely the big issue for this video is just the 40-year Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. As a refresher, Period 8 is going to be approximately 15% of your AP test. So Period 8 and 7 together are 30%. So make sure you really do be strategic about focusing in your review on the stuff that's going to get you the most bang for your buck. So foreign policy deals with everything we're going to do in interactions, both military and diplomatic and economic, with other nations. So starting with 1945 and the end of World War II, and we're going to cover today all the way up to the Obama administration to make sure that we are good to go on the foreign policy developments post-World War II. So a couple big ideas worth noting. These won't necessarily go in order, but because we're going to go chronologically. But the Cold War ideologies, who believes and why. Make sure you're just familiar with the differences between communism and capitalism and why they are vehemently opposed to the expansion of each other. We're going to hit the Cold War in Europe. We're going to hit the Cold War in Asia, places like Korea, China, Vietnam. The Cold War in the Middle East with issues like Iran and Egypt. Cold War in Latin America. Issues in hotspots like Nicaragua. And Guatemala, and then we'll talk about the thawing of the Cold War through the 1980s, as well as just real briefly foreign policies post-Cold War. Cool, so let's get going. As you guys know, or I hope you know, the roots of the Cold War go back really even to the Russian Revolution and the fact that the U.S. doesn't even recognize the USSR as a legitimate nation until 1933, and that we're not really friends through World War II. We share an enemy in that Nazi Germany. So things aren't actually ever really friendly between the two sides, but they come together to at least keep the world together during World War II, and then immediately basically split up afterwards. Now the U.S. is going to join the United Nations in 1943. The U.S. is going to be one of 6 members on the Permanent Security Council, so one of the 6 nations that always has a vote on basically everything. The USSR is going to actually hold the same position for a short time before a lot of tension is going to upset the balance there in the United Nations. But the UN is going to really serve as the international peacekeeping organization that the League of Nations was never able to do, because the UN is actually large, legitimate, enforceable, and the U.S. joins where the League of Nations was none of those things. And really, the Cold War itself is an ideological struggle. Communism wants to take over the world. Communism can't exist where capitalism exists. Capitalism doesn't necessarily want to take over the world, but doesn't want communism too, because then the capitalist nations wouldn't have markets to sell their stuff in, and it would create all kinds of trouble and conflict. So it's a really big ideological struggle between the two sides. And that ideological struggle has roots in the 1920s, 30s, and early 40s. Other reasons, Stalin is quite salty that the atomic bomb is dropped without his knowledge. He doesn't know about the project. He doesn't know the U.S. has it until it happens, so he thinks he's kind of left out of the loop. He's still mad about the fact that the U.S. and Great Britain took forever to open a second front in Europe, which he thinks prolongs the war on his side of things and makes him have more casualties. And there's a ton of conflict about Eastern Europe, which Stalin wants to keep under his control, despite the fact that he agreed earlier in World War II to let them have democratic elections and not be under Soviet control. So there's a lot of these roots to this conflict. The Yalta Conference it really does expose this conflict, as Stalin backs down on what he said he would do, and he says, I'm going to keep Eastern Europe as a buffer zone. There's a bunch of corrupt elections that take place in Eastern Europe as people that are loyal to Stalin are elected, and these nations are propped up as pro-Soviet governments, and the Red Soviet Army has not left Eastern Europe. So it's quite clear even from during World War II, the ideological struggle of the Cold War is going to take place quite quickly. A couple events that really kick off the event, so to speak, of the Cold War is Churchill's Iron Curtain speech as he comes to the U.S. and he's trying to get the U.S.'s attention and warn the U.S. about what's happening in Eastern Europe. And he says, an Iron Curtain has descended across Europe from the Adriatic to the Baltic. All the old ancient capitals of Europe are behind this Iron Curtain of ideological struggle. Also, George Kennan, a longtime diplomat in Europe, he's going to send what's called his long telegram. It's quite long. And really what the long telegram is going to become is the foundation for containment policy. And containment policy is going to really push all of the U.S. foreign policy actions throughout the Cold War, which really says, quite simply, that we're fine with where the Soviet Union exists. We just don't want them to expand anywhere new. If we stop Soviet expansion, then they can just have their little bubble of the world, their sphere of influence, and free elections and capitalism will reign supreme elsewhere. I'm going to argue the containment policy is quite similar to the policy towards the South and slavery, and that free soil ideology and that Republican ideology of we're not going to mess with slavery where it is, but we just don't want it to spread out. Now, of course, both communism and slavery are systems that can only succeed if allowed to spread out. So, of course, these ideas are categorically opposed to each other. Now, Truman's going to have the brunt of the beginning Cold War policies as all these foundational plans and these outlays and these early conflicts are going to happen under his presidency because, of course, he's president at the end of World War II and right after World War II. So the first real issue that pops up is Greece and Turkey. Now, Greece and Turkey are two nations that are actively opposing the spread of communism into their nation. And what Truman proposes and then enacts is the Truman Doctrine, which allows for military and economic aid. So we're going to supply the people of Greece and Turkey in their fight against the spread of communism. We're not going to fight the fight for them, but because they are actively opposing the spread of communism, the key word there is actively opposing the spread of communism, we will support them militarily and economically with no troops, but supplies, resources, weapons, etc. So because they're actively opposing the spread of communism, we will supply them with those things. And the Marshall Plan is a little more proactive and front-loading in its action steps. The Marshall Plan is proposed for Western Europe. All the nations of Western Europe are invited to partake. And it really is an economic plan to rebuild Western Europe so that Western Europe is stable, it is secure, it is successful economically, and therefore it will not be prone to the spread of communism. The way I explained it in class is the Marshall Plan is basically taking vitamins so that you don't get sick, so that you are just healthy in general. The Truman Doctrine is when you start to feel sick and you are actively taking vitamin C or Dayquil or whatever it is you do, soup, to make sure that you don't get any sicker. So vitamins so you don't get sick and you stay healthy. Oh my God, I'm getting a little bit sick. I better do something about it. Truman Doctrine. Now, under Truman's Cold War, we also see the Berlin blockade. Stalin decides that it's best to just blockade Berlin from being supplied. He wants to keep Berlin in the eastern sphere. As you guys should know from our map analysis in class, the capital of Germany is in East Germany. So while Germany itself as a nation is divided between East and West, even Berlin, the capital, is also divided. Stalin doesn't like the fact that there is Western influences in West Berlin, in his Eastern Germany sphere of influence. So he blockades Berlin. And the response actually is quite remarkable. The Berlin airlift, in which our B-2 bombers are taking off every 6 to 7 minutes for months on end, dropping water and supplies and fuel and resources and Christmas cards and gifts for the kids in West Berlin when Christmas comes. Shows the world that the U.S. is really committed to supplying its allies with what they need. As things get a little uglier in Europe, the U.S. forms, with its other allies in Europe, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is significant because it really is the first ever peacetime, excuse me, let me fix that for you, peacetime military alliance in U.S. history. Now, the United Nations is not a military alliance, it's a peacekeeping organization. But NATO is the first time ever that the U.S., during a time of undeclared non wartime, establishes a military alliance. With it, of course, there's Great Britain and France and Germany. And that the thinking here is in the words of their mantra, an attack on one is an attack on all. So this would really make George Washington turn in his grave as he realizes that now the U.S. is fully involved in alliances and European affairs. Under Truman, we see the Department of Defense created, and with it, the National Security Council to advise the president on national security events. One of their early memos, the NSC, National Security Council, 68, recommends that the U.S. best approach to these problems is a massive military buildup. It says that the Soviets are not going to stop spreading without force, so the U.S. should be ready to meet that force at any and all times. The NSC 68 turns out correct when, with Soviet backing, North Korea invades South Korea shortly thereafter. Under Truman, the U.S. also detonates its first hydrogen bomb because the Soviets caught us very quickly on the atomic bomb, and the atom race is on. Under Truman, China falls to communism. Truman is made to look as if he's soft. Truman, quote unquote, lost China. He didn't do anything about the fact that China fell to communism, when in reality there wasn't really quite much he could do. So China falls. So now under Truman, kind of this big fear of communism, it becomes a little more exaggerated as we look at the world and realize that both the Soviet Union and China, the two biggest geographic countries in the world, are both communism. And under Truman, we have the beginnings and the stalemate of the Korean War. North Korea, backed by the communist China and Soviet Union, invades South Korea. The war itself is not necessarily important, but there is a ton of conflict between Truman, the president, and General McCarthy, he of World War II fame, over how exactly to go about the war. McCarthy's a little wild. He wants to just drop atomic bombs on China while we have the arms advantage and just end this for once and for all. He gets overruled by Truman. He gets fired by Truman. It causes a bunch of conflict. And by the time Truman's term has ended, the Korean War has come to a full stalemate, a full tide that's not going anywhere. Eisenhower, when running for president in 52, promises to go to Korea and end the conflict, and when elected, that's kind of exactly what he does. However, the Korean War is still ongoing today. There is this armistice, this temporary peace that is set up. The countries are divided at a dividing line between the two countries, and according to North Korea and South Korea, the war is still ongoing, despite the fact that it's not an active war. Now, Eisenhower's Cold War is a little different than Truman's. His policy is going to be called brinksmanship. The idea of massive retaliation. If I get other nations to think that if they do anything wrong, I'm going to massively retaliate, then they're not going to do anything wrong. Under him, we're going to see a large buildup of our atomic resources. As I said, he is going to end the Korean War, at least the U.S. participation in it, despite the fact that the war is still ongoing. And under his watch, we have the people of Hungary try to rebel and revolt against Soviet control. They expect that we'll come to their aid and help them. Unfortunately, that does not happen. No support. Sorry, Hungary. Without the U.S. support, Hungary is crushed. But Eisenhower doesn't help Hungary because he realizes that starting another war in Europe is a terrible idea. So the Hungarian people are left stranded. Under Eisenhower's Cold War, we see the death of Stalin, which does lead to, at least short-term, some relaxation in Cold War tension as the Soviet Union are kind of in flux. And Nikita Khrushchev, the new premier of Soviet Union, he begins looking for ways to have what he calls peaceful coexistence, right? We don't need to win. They don't need to win. We can kind of just peacefully coexist in our different sides of the world. A couple other things that happened under Eisenhower's Cold War. The Soviets beat us into space with Sputnik, the first satellite, which really scares the U.S. into thinking they're falling behind in the Cold War. Because of Sputnik, the U.S. creates the National Defense Education Act. With it, of course, as I talked about in class, AP classes, try to get our kids more educated and ahead so that we can beat the Soviets. That's why you're watching this video right now, so that you can beat the Soviets. Thanks, AP. Also, the creation of NASA comes as a response to Sputnik as we try to find a quicker way into space. And also under Eisenhower's Cold War, we had the very embarrassing U-2 incident in which one of our spy planes is shot down over the Soviet Union. We try to act as if it wasn't a spy plane, it's just a weather plane, and the Soviets are like, you're wrong, we have your spy. And it's quite embarrassing, actually, as a conflict. So, two issues that really pop up Cold War wide under Eisenhower is the beginnings of the Cold War in the Middle East and the beginnings of the Cold War in Latin America. Now, in the Middle East, specifically in Iran, the CIA kind of backs a revolution against a democratically elected leader to put somebody in power who will be loyal to us. Now, in this case, it is a brutal, terrible human called the Shah of Iran. But he's a terrible man. He's really bad to his people. He's not a cool dude, but he's pro-United States in terms of oil policy. So we do this because we don't want Iran to nationalize their oil, because to them that smells like communism, and then we can't have access to the oil. And we want to have somebody there who's loyal to us. Back to that policy of the Cold War of an enemy of my enemy is my friend. So the CIA and the U.S. props up this terrible dictatorship in Iran. In Egypt, we have the Suez oil crisis when Egypt tries to nationalize the Suez Canal. That really makes Great Britain, Israel, and France angry. They invade Egypt, and actually Eisenhower sides with Egypt and tells Great Britain and France to move on with their lives and not do any invasions of Egypt. That conflict gets settled with nations still having access to the Suez Canal. And then in response to all of these conflicts, we see the creation of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries in 1960, as these nations that really have no legitimacy or power in overseas negotiations other than oil are going to band together in their shared resource of oil. And that's going to cause some conflicts in the 1970s. So the big conflict you should know of Eisenhower in the Middle East is Iran. And there's a similar situation actually in Guatemala, as the CIA helps overthrow a leftist, left-leaning, communist-leaning government and allows for a strong-armed dictator to take over, but at least he's not communist, even though he's going to kill many of his people and create all kinds of conflict in the country. Also, in Latin America, we see Cuba, where the CIA tries to stop what's happening there unsuccessfully, as Fidel Castro takes over as the dude in charge of Cuba. He's going to nationalize or take over for the nation of Cuba American businesses. That's going to make America very angry. The U.S. is going to embargo or blockade all trade from Cuba, but we can't really do anything about Fidel Castro despite numerous assassination and revolution attempts, which I'll get to later. But maybe Eisenhower's biggest legacy thing as he leaves office is his farewell address in which he warns America of the military-industrial complex. I went over it a little bit in the domestic policy video, but he warns America, guys, be really warned that the more we rely on our military for all of our outputs of thought and energy and excess and income and investment, the more heavily we'll be relying on the military to prop up our nation's stability. It's quite a good speech, quite a good wording. It's in your notes from Period 8 if you're curious to go back and read it. I highly recommend it. After Eisenhower in election in 1960, we get John F. Kennedy as he beats Nixon, as I discussed in the domestic policy video. And his Cold War approach is going to be called flexible response. He wants to get the U.S. away from the arms race and from the brinksmanship of Eisenhower, where we only had one response, and it was nuclear death. He's going to push for more conventional options, more covert, secret, hidden options, like the Green Berets, and build up our conventional forces instead of our atomic forces so that we can move our both nations away from mutually assured destruction. Under Kennedy, we're going to have the creation of the Alliance for Progress. Is going to push for economic development for Latin America. This is kind of similar to what happens with the Marshall Plan. Are thinking that if we invest economically in these countries, then they'll be stable and won't fall to communism, with some successes and some failures. Under Kennedy, we have the Bay of Pigs disaster, in which the CIA tries to send old Cuban exiles back to Cuba to start a revolution, but without any actual military backing from the U.S., it is an utter disaster. They are put down quite quickly by Fidel Castro's forces, and it's a foreign policy embarrassment and nightmare for Kennedy's presidency. Under Kennedy, we see the Berlin Wall go up as the Soviets are pissed and tired of people leaving East Berlin to go to West Berlin. What that says about communism and capitalism, you can surmise for yourself. But the Berlin Wall becomes a really big symbol, a symbolic barrier to the two divided sides between Eastern and Western worlds. And it stays up until the 1990s. And the big impact of Kennedy's Cold War is with the Cuban Missile Crisis. We find out because of spy planes that the Soviets are beginning to install nuclear warheads on the island of Cuba, incredibly close to the United States. What are the options? The U.S. can bomb Cuba and potentially get us into World War III as the Soviets retaliate. We can invade Cuba. There's a variety of really bad, possibly terrible options. What Kennedy decides is to quarantine Cuba, to blockade Cuba, as the Soviet ships with the rest of the materials for the nuclear warheads approach. The world watches. We don't know what's going to happen. Of course, this is before cell phones and before internet. People are doing atomic bombs drills under their desks. Everyone thinks they're going to die. In the end, the quarantine is successful. The Soviets back down. Kennedy backs down. And in return, the U.S. promises not to invade Cuba. That makes the Soviets happy. And behind closed doors, Kennedy agrees to take missiles out of Turkey. Which will make the Soviets happy as well. The impact of the Cuban Missile Crisis, however, it's the closest the two nations get to full-on nuclear war. So the two nations decide to put a hotline telephone between the two powers so they can stop talking through third, fourth, fifth, and sixth parties. And a time period of détente or relaxed tensions takes over as both sides realize how close they got to ending the world. All over Cuba. Now, as you know, Kennedy dies after about 1,000 days of his presidency, and LBJ takes over. And the big foreign policy issue under LBJ is going to be Vietnam. Now, the U.S. began getting involved in Vietnam under Eisenhower with military advisors. That involvement escalates under Kennedy, as the U.S. again supports a really shady dude because he's not communist. In this case, the guy's name is No Din Diem. So Kennedy ramps things up. Johnson's kind of stuck in this one. He can't walk away from Vietnam because then he would be accused of being soft on communism and he'd lose all his credibility. And he's having a hard time dealing with what to do about Vietnam, which from the beginning really is an unwinnable war. Now, the big turning point in Vietnam is the Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which apparently North Vietnamese troops and resources fired on a U.S. boat in the Gulf of Tonkin. So Congress passes the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which is basically a blank check to the president to do whatever he needs to do in Vietnam to make sure that we contain communism. Now, as you guys know, Congress has the power to declare war. It's Congress's right and authority, constitutionally speaking, to declare war. What they do with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is they basically give that power away to the president to put ground troops in Vietnam, to escalate Vietnam. And from that point on, in 1964, 65, 66, 67, and 68, we're going to send more and more and more and more and more troops to Vietnam, despite the fact that we can't win this war. The American people are being told that the war is almost over. Light is at the end of the tunnel. Success is just around the corner. It's almost done. We're going to win any minute, guys. And the Tet Offensive is really going to change that. The Vietnamese holiday of Tet, as the North Vietnamese forces launch a fully unexpected, fully coordinated attack on over 25 different U.S. bases, showing that no, the war is not anywhere close to over. It's that event that really leads to a huge anti-war opposition. The protest movement, the anti-war protests, the counterculture. It's also worth noting that the election of 1868 really does show this divide in society, as LBJ decides just not to run for president again. RFK, who promises to get America out of Vietnam, gets shot and killed while running for president, and the election itself is a big indicator of American public opinion on the anti-war protests. In 68, as Nixon wins, it really is a statement of anti-liberalism at home, but anti-protests, conservatism at home, as the American people speak up and say they don't like the war, but they also don't like people protesting their American war. Now, Nixon's Cold War is going to really take place in two different places. Vietnam, which is going to be really all sorts of terrible, and China, which is going to be a little better than that. Nixon's approach to Vietnam, what he says it's going to be, is going to be called Vietnamization or peace with honor, as he pledges to keep support for Asia. We're going to keep supporting the countries that need support that we've promised to support, but we're going to do so without ground support. So we're going to pull the troops out of Vietnam. We're going to make sure that the Vietnam is fighting their own war. And in that sense, we are going to ensure that the U.S. does not have to carry a heavy burden for a heavy physical burden for the Vietnam War itself. Now, under Nixon's presidency, a couple things that aren't quite Vietnamization take place. The first is the My Lai massacre that becomes public, in which it is exposed that U.S. troops are getting really fed up with the war itself, because every time they go into a village, that village says they're all happy and loyal and American, and they feed them rice and life is good. And then from that very same village, the same night, you're having rocket-propelled grenades being launched into the U.S. camp. And the U.S. troops lash out by massacring a ton of women and children. The photographs come out, and it makes the war effort look really bad. Also under Nixon, we see the bombing and invasion of two neighboring nations that are neutrals, Laos and Cambodia. Once that becomes public, that really, really creates an escalation in the protest response. And it's there where we see the protests actually getting violent, with students being shot and killed at both Kent State and Jackson State. We see the bombing escalation of North Vietnam take place in 1972, in which we're going to actually be bombing them more than at any time under Johnson's presidency. Under Kennedy, we also have the issue with the Pentagon Papers, in which papers are leaked to the New York Times. They are publishing the papers and make the war look really, really shady and bad. Nixon sues to have them stop publishing the papers, but New York Times versus the United States rules that nope, freedom of the press is absolute, and they can release those papers. And then Congress acts and passes the War Powers Act in 1973, which takes away the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, takes away Nixon's ability to just fight the war however he wants. It really is Congress taking back their war power. By 1973, the Vietnam War is over. The U.S. troops are all withdrawn. It's not over. It's over for the U.S. at least. We have a ceasefire between the two sides in 1973. However, by 1975, all of South Vietnam has fallen to the communists. Saigon, the South Vietnamese capital, has been renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and all of Vietnam is united under communist rule. So Nixon doesn't do too hot here. Not a good look on Vietnam, not a good look on the protests and the killings of students, not a good look on the My Lai massacre, not a good look on really the Pentagon Papers or any of it. But he does do some good stuff with China and the USSR. His policy towards the other nations is détente, to reduce the tensions. And what he's going to try to do is play the USSR, the Soviet Union, and China against each other. He's going to get a little cozier, a little more friendly with China. The U.S. is going to formally recognize China by 1979, but Nixon's going to be the first president to visit communist China, which is going to make the Soviet Union a little nervous. And he's able to negotiate in a way that other presidents weren't, because he has a reputation for being really hard on communists, really tough on communism. He's not a soft dude. He's got a really tough reputation. So he's able to have this negotiating power without worrying about being criticized at home. Under Nixon, we have the passage of the SALT I Treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I, between us and the Soviet Union, which is really a first step towards de-arming and de-escalating the arms race. Of course, on domestic fronts, Nixon struggles through a bunch of scandals before finally resigning, despite promising that he was not a crook, resigning the presidency and having Gerald Ford take over. And here is Ford's foreign policy. There is none. Now, shortly after, we elect Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, and his foreign policy is going to be much more humanitarian. He wants to only do morally upstanding things in the world. But under him, a bunch of stuff hits the fan, and it all goes south and all bad. And he really is symbolic of 1970s Cold War world. We have the OPEC oil embargo, which causes a huge gas shortage in the United States, which increases our stagflation on the home front. It's more of a domestic issue, though. But it all comes because there's the Yom Kippur War between Egypt and Iran versus Israel. The U.S. supports Israel, because the U.S. always supports Israel. And that makes the OPEC nations angry, so they embargo our oil. One big win for Carter's foreign policy are the Camp David Accords. in which he brings Israel and Egypt together in the United States, and they settle their dispute peacefully, allowing Israel and Egypt to coexist in the Middle East for quite a while, actually. There's other times in which tension flares up, but the Camp David Accords are super important for establishing the foundation of peace for Israel in the Middle East. However, under Carter's foreign policy, Carter's presidency, that shady Shah of Iran, who we were supporting, he is overthrown. Why? Because he's a terrible leader. So, as people are wont to do, they overthrow their leader when they're unhappy, much like the U.S. does with King George. And they install a much more radical Islam-based regime in Iran, which causes them to cut off more of our oil because they don't like the fact that we had been supporting the Shah all this time, which is okay. We can deal with the oil shortage. However, the Iranian hostage crisis is what really does Carter's presidency in, as over 50 American diplomats are kept hostage in Iran for over a year. Carter tries negotiation. Carter tries rescue efforts. Carter sends some secret helicopters in to rescue them. The secret helicopters crash into each other in the rescue efforts, and it really just is symbolic of the 1970s disaster that is American domestic and foreign policy, that we can't even get our hostages home from freaking Iran. So Americans are looking at themselves in the mirror and thinking to themselves, like, I thought we were America. I thought we were powerful, and now we can't even get our diplomats home from a country that nobody in America could even find on the map. So Carter, of course, does not get a second term, which leads us to Reagan's 1980s. Now, Jonathan Ramos is a big fan of Reagan's foreign policy, but Jonathan Ramos is largely wrong, as usual. Reagan's foreign policy is to be aggressive and assertive to the Soviet Union. People get all excited when he calls them the evil empire in a speech. I don't understand what the big deal is. But, I mean, if you're really confused, you can ask Ramos. But he does really show more of a backbone to the Soviet Union, especially after the Soviet Union escalates the Cold War at the tail end of Carter's presidency by invading Afghanistan. Reagan actually gets along quite well with the guy in charge of the Soviet Union at that time, Mikhail Gorbachev. So they begin some diplomatic efforts to reduce tensions. But Reagan's really going to just put all of his eggs in one basket, and that is defense spending. We're going to spend every dollar available on missiles and planes and bombs, because that way we won't be able to afford food stamps for people who aren't white. So that's Reagan's Cold War. Under him, we see the Strategic Defense Initiative, also called Star Wars, in which we create a system of satellites to shoot down missiles from space, but we can't afford to treat anybody with AIDS. Under Reagan's policies as well, we have the secret, shady Iran-Contra affair, which I went over at pretty great length in class. Long story short, Congress tells Reagan he can't support the pro-American forces in Nicaragua. So behind closed doors, we sell some weapons to Iran. We take that money to pay the pro-American forces in Nicaragua. Once it all gets exposed, it looks really bad and shady. But Reagan does not go down for it in a way that other presidents would have, because he's popular and he smiles a lot. Oh, and he doesn't like brown people. Also of note, during Reagan's foreign policy are some changes on the Soviet front that are the really things that end the Cold War between the U.S. and Soviet Union. Those are glasnost and perestroika. Now, Gorbachev realizes that his nation is crumbling, that it has fallen prey to the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about, that it has spent its entire money and infrastructure and development of everything into the military, and he realizes that the Soviet Union will not be a successful country in 10 more years unless they create some reforms to their system. So the first reform is glasnost, the elements of some democracy into the Soviet Union. For example, the allowance of a legitimate actual election for their first legislative branch. And the second is perestroika, or enabling people to own their own property, to own their own businesses, which introduces some capitalism into the Soviet Union as well. So, like most instances of human history, once people have some freedom, they want more freedom, and that's going to allow the Soviet Union to crumble from within, as a series of revolutions in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union have the Soviet Union crumble by 1991. The Eastern European states are then allowed to have their own free elections, and the Soviet Union goes back to just being called Russia. And then Stalin comes back from the dead, and he's very angry, and he appoints I'm just making things up now. After Reagan, just so that you have a couple things in your back pocket in case this stuff pops up on the test, we have Daddy Bush. His big issue is the Persian Gulf War, in which we get involved in Iraq over their invasion of a neighboring country of Kuwait, where we see Saddam Hussein playing a large role as a terrible dude. Daddy Bush comes in, we invade Iraq, the war's over in like 6 days. Under Clinton, we have a big push towards globalization as his foreign policy. NAFTA, I talked about in the last video, but just this idea of creating a more global economy or more global society. If you really want to know more about NAFTA, you can listen to, for example, Donald Trump rant and rave about how angry he is about it, despite not quite knowing exactly what it is. We have the Bosnian conflict that the U.S. gets involved in, more of a humanitarian effort as well in Eastern Europe. That's worth noting. Under Baby Bush, the big foreign policy issues are 9/11, of course, the attacks on the World Trade Center and the White House, which lead to the war on terror and any nation that will harbor terrorists, leading us directly to get involved in Afghanistan, totally justified, with good reason, and at least short term, some good results. And Iraq, which I'm not really quite sure what the connection was between the terrorists 9/11 and Iraq, but I'm sure that Baby Bush was just mad that his dad couldn't quite kill Osama bin Laden. I'm sorry, Saddam Hussein. So we get involved back in Iraq post 9/11. Finally, under Obama, his big foreign policy wins or events are the killing of Osama bin Laden. It's a big win, as well as the Arab Spring in the early 2000s. Early 2010s, in which we see a huge growth of revolutionary movements in places like Egypt, as these nations of the Arab world are attempting to democratize themselves as well. So that's it for foreign policy post 1945. As always, if you are confused, please, for the love of God, ask a question. I hope this was helpful, and I will see you guys soon. Thank you.